It's a pleasure to be here with you. I'm a big admirer of your work and very happy for everyone to be here listening to us chat mycology and mushrooms. Um, I figured I'd just sort of take it and run with it at this point. The subject of this is the mounting interest in mycology and mushrooms, fungi, that seems to have been carrying on for some years now. I have some theories as to why that might be, but I'm curious what you think is behind the seemingly sudden interest in mushrooms over the last few years.
I think there's a few things going on. First of all, good to be here with you, and I'm an admirer of your work too, and I'm grateful to be at the Oxford Real Farming Conference, albeit virtually, and an admirer of this event. So thanks to everyone for putting this on and giving it all the energy and dedication that they have. With regard to fungi having a moment, I think there's a few things. First of all, for me, I see it as fungi having a moment as much as mushrooms, and mushrooms being actually a very small subsection of the fungal world, even for those fungi that produce mushrooms. But so yeah, a few things. I mean, one I think is definitely technological. We just know more about fungi than we did before. I think this is at the root of this boom of interest in microbes more generally, bacteria, for example, and the microbiome. We know more than we did, so there's more to talk about. There's more for us to be fascinated in. There is more for us to research. Much of this research it concerns subvisible realms that are not immediately available to us, and so technologies like DNA sequencing make a huge difference to what we're able to know. So I think at the bedrock is a technological shift that grants us greater access. But I don't think that's everything. So I think there's more as well. So I think part of it is the worsening ecological crises we find ourselves in, and a general ecological turn, not just in the sciences, but also in the arts and in society more generally. A greater awareness of the networks of interaction and interdependence within which we're embedded, and fungi are ecological poster organisms. They live their lives as networks. And I think they make sense to us in an ecological mood, more than when we're not in an ecological mood. So I think that's part of it. I think part of it is that there are a number of ways that fungi can help us adapt to a whole wild world of crises that we face, whether in new types of technology, new ways of producing medicines, and all of these various things I'm sure we'll talk more about later. So I think that has got people's interest, and also I think the general network zeitgeist that we're in, networks become a master concept. Obviously there's the internet, World Wide Web, but more than that, I think that we find network models being used to understand all sorts of areas of human study, whether it be the biochemical reactions within a cell, or social network analysis, whatever it might be. So they're also fungi are network poster organisms and fit neatly within this increasingly network vision. And of course, psychedelics, this resurgence of interest in psychedelics, much of which has taken place with fungal compounds. And I think that has really, I've noticed at least that has brought more attention to the fungal world, and has piqued people's interest about what fungi are and what they can do.
Yeah, I mean, there's not a whole lot I can add to that. I think that covers a lot of the bases, but I also love the way you phrase things like poster organisms. I like terms like that. But we might just elaborate a little on a couple of those from my point of view. I mean, it seems like there's a symbolic and a practical level to the interest. Like people can do more things with fungi, about fungi, in order to learn through technology, like you were saying. It's also the fact that they're so understudied, and there's so much to be learned. And it so happens that the tools that are emerging now in DNA sequencing in particular are revealing how much has been misapprehended about their relationships and their descendants and things like that. So it's this just giant box of learning opportunity for people to jump into, and more people can do so. And I feel like, my book was definitely more focused on like are mostly focused on like the citizen science sort of subculture around mycology, and obviously technologically enabled, but also this sense, I think, that enabled by this sense that like anyone can contribute in a maybe a unique way to mycology, thanks to the availability of technology largely, but also the availability of knowledge that's been gathered over the last, especially the last century, I suppose, when mycology really sort of came into its own as a science, a formal science. But it was, I guess, from what I researched, it was formed through a citizen science sort of milieu that became formalized. Do I have that right? I feel like that is almost like a perfect, syllogism for where we're at now.
Yeah, no, I think that is right, and of course, it was the case with all of the sciences that the sciences only became professionalized in the way that we think of them now, with research universities and so forth in the 19th century. So, Darwin, a very famous amateur, of course, studying all sorts of aspects of the living world in his garden with his kids, walking around the countryside. In a network of astonishing correspondence with amateurs everywhere, plant breeders, pigeon fanciers, the biggest collection of amateur, in the true sense of the word, passionately dedicated people, diving every day deeper into their fascination. So I think that mycology remained, because it didn't become, because fungi weren't recognized as their own kingdom of life until so late, until the 60s. There weren't departments of mycology. There weren't professorships of mycology in the same way that there were professors of zoology and botany. Of course, there were ways to study fungi within institutions, because they were thought of as plants. So it was usually something that would take place in plant sciences departments, botany schools. But there were fewer opportunities to do so. So I think that mycology remained more in the citizen science amateur field for longer than perhaps some other branches of biology. And something that we notice today, there's so many wonderful ways that mycology is being driven forward by the work of dedicated amateurs in the true sense of the word.
Yeah, I've loved that point of clarification on the word amateur, like to do something out of love. What could be a better reason to do something, or better motivation? Yeah, and I guess it is still a largely citizen science-led field of inquiry, and maybe increasingly so. I don't know if the pace of sort of formalization or acceptance in mainstream biology of mycology as something serious and distinct is sort of keeping pace with the growth in the sort of subculture and citizen science side of things, but they seem to be holding hands in a way, and maybe that owes to the legacy that you just pointed to. Like it's always been that way, and that to me is maybe it points to the more symbolic side of things or the more notional side of things, which is that like mycology, like mycelium, seem a bit subversive. They, defy boundaries. They operate underneath the surface of things, and I feel like maybe it's no wonder that the study of them also sort of elides typical categorization and operates between the cracks in the sciences. But it also feels like you were mentioning earlier, we're in a moment of catastrophe, and so, I dare say, certainly enormous change occurring, and they are entering our consciousness at a moment when things are sort of falling apart and hopefully reordering again. And no wonder, again, mushrooms and fungi are recyclers and recomposers, as you've said in your book, and that's comforting in a way, I guess. Do you find that people are maybe a little reassured by the notion that, like, hey, these organisms that we can increasingly, as networked beings ourselves, relate to, have found a symbiotic role in their ecologies, have learned to be part of those ecologies rather than exploiters or extractors from them? It seems like maybe we could learn something from fungi in this moment as we become more interconnected and maybe operate a little more like they do in a literal sense. Am I overthinking that?
I don't think you're overthinking it. I think there are definitely some hazards when we try to there are lots of fungi, for example, that I think of as being very opportunistic, and that will feed themselves until they're satiated and grow until they can't grow anymore. And now, of course, there are fungi that behave in ways that we would never dream of, or at least I would never want to behave in. I'm thinking of the fungi that grow inside insect bodies, for example, or all sorts of other gory and terrifying examples of fungal life. So but on the whole, I think that there is some. I mean, I think there's some reassuring story to absorb from the fact that these organisms have persisted through the 5 great extinctions. Many are in huge trouble right now, as animals and plants are. Many animals and plants are too, and any other numberless number of microbes that that we don't even know how to name, let alone know how to document. But nonetheless, I think it's reassuring that fungi, as world builders, as key ecological connectors, have persisted through these extinction events, and also that symbioses tend to be forged in times of crisis, and that it's in these moments of wild ecological flux, or the need in reaching for some new ecological possibility, that organisms come together to extend their reach, to allow them to withstand conditions that they couldn't withstand by themselves. And so I think this is really a moment of where the lichenizing metaphor, lichen symbiotic organisms are merging out of a relationship between fungi and algae, of fungi and bacteria. That lichen metaphors can really serve us here. And who better to lichenize with than organisms who have persisted through the 5 great extinction events. And so I do think there are ways to partner with fungi to help us adapt, although I wouldn't want to base our behavior on all types of fungi.
Right. Yeah, and to lichenize with the kingdom of fungi, but also with one another. I think I feel like our moment is one of recognizing our impact on the world and or coming to grips with it. I think we've recognized it for a long time, but also coming to grips with our responsibility to work together and to operate as a collective organism with respect to the other collective organisms of which we're all sort of part. Like one of the other sort of subversive aspects of mycology that I find so interesting is the binary defying aspect of it, and the idea that, I mean, what is it, Schizophilum commune has something like 26,000 mating types, and symbioses can switch from mutualist to parasitic or saprobic in under certain conditions, and all of the like categories that we have, even the taxonomies that we use. Obviously DNA has been subverting those, or DNA study at least. So it's just this like giant field of challenges to our presuppositions, it seems to me. Like the subject of mycology, or the way these organisms are and how they've emerged, sort of challenges a lot of our assumptions about how things relate, and how we relate to the planet and one another, which is like one and the same. That's sort of, to me, is like the dissolution of the individual is kind of a conclusion I've reached through just encountering fungi. I haven't studied them at the depth that you have, or that any real mycologist has, but even from my generalist encounter with them, it's really changed my perspective on the relations of all things, and my role in the world, our role in the world. And I get the sense that's a common experience among those who develop a relationship with fungi. It seems to bring that out in a way that other areas of study might. I don't know. I didn't talk to many fern experts or bryophyte experts, but it seems like mycology is unique in that way. Is that true, do you think?
I definitely have noticed a certain type of wildness to the weird fascinations you find among mycologists. And I thought you documented that so well in your book. And I think part of it is to do, as you say, with the fact that these organisms are weird, that they worry our distinctions, that they force us to question our categories, and that fungal life is corrosive to so many of these the concepts that we use to organize our lives and behaviors. For me, one of the healthiest parts of studying fungi is to feel those categories shifting, melting, recomposing. You see this a lot with fungal taxonomy, for example. And anyone in the world of fungi will probably be fascinated and frustrated in equal measure at how much fungi tend to slip around in the systems of classification that we build for them. That fungal taxonomy is in a constant state of flux and revision. The system that we have, the Linnaean system, wasn't really designed for fungi. And so we get led into all sorts of paradoxes and confusions. And have to reevaluate our systems, the systems by which we use to order and configure our systems of order. And I think that's more generally the case with fungi. So they invite us into a kind of weirdness, and into a state of open questions, which I think is really a healthy place to be.
We've touched on the subject of the taxonomy and study of biodiversity, fungal biodiversity, which is, I don't know where we're at with the assumed sort of percentage of let's say mushroom producing fungi that we've identified or named. It's in the 10% range, I believe. That's the assumption. And I know you're very involved in the effort to include fungal biodiversity under the same sort of, to prioritize it alongside animals, plants, any other organism that we study and make provisions for, if we're building something or making some change in the landscape. Can you speak to the importance of documenting fungal biodiversity and where we're at in that project?
Mm-hmm. It's always so hard to know where we're at, really, overall. There are so many confusing things. For example, when one documents a fungal species, is one documenting a fungal species for which there is specimen material? Has this actually been called a species? Or are you documenting fungal diversity using DNA sequence, in which case many of the taxa that you're describing don't actually have a species name attached to them? It's not actually possible to do that without physical specimens. And so for many fungi and many fungal diversity projects, one's making assumptions about who's there without really knowing details about who all of these characters are. And that's important for all sorts of reasons. One is if you want to look at how fungal communities shift, and you can look at fungal communities using DNA sequencing in different places, and you can see gain some understanding of how those communities assemble, how they change across environmental gradients, how they change in response to certain human activities. So lots of ways to study fungal diversity. Quite different activities. If one is going around in the forest looking for mushrooms, which is a hugely important activity, but one has to be in the right place at the right time, because that fungus could be there all year and produce a mushroom for 3 or 4 days of that year, and if you're not there on those 3 or 4 days, you aren't going to see the mushroom. So there's ways of bringing these different types of study together, and part of that is to invite us to think more about the hidden lives that do so many important things. These hidden lives that make the world in which we live. And so some of these projects that I'm involved in, particularly with the Juliana Ferti, the 3Fs project, where we're trying to get fungi included, as you said, alongside animals and plants, with flora, fauna, and funga, to add the third F to our litanies of conservation. Partly because from a policy point of view, if there's nothing under threat, there's nothing to protect. If there's nothing under threat, then funding doesn't get unlocked. Educational opportunities aren't made for those organisms. So part of it is just to get us to spend as much time as we spend looking at animals and plants, spend as much time looking at fungi, teaching people about fungi, teaching kids about fungi, producing grants that research students can take to go and learn more about fungi. So a lot of it's that, and these conservation structures and strictures are big, complex, imperfect, bureaucratic systems. But nonetheless, small tweaks within them, I think, can be very effective and powerful. And I think this is one of those areas, a pressure point that we can push on to to really drive innovation and fascination.
Yeah, not to mention that mushrooms in particular, I think most people don't really think about fungi outside of mushrooms, but they have a certain cultural connotation in a lot of places. That's the term it's used a lot is mycophobia. And so maybe there's a little bit of just inset resistance to the idea of giving birth to these weird organisms. But I think precisely because they are so strange, there is this interest in encountering them. They really are encounters too, like you were saying. You don't know whether it's not like a tree that was there 2 years ago. It's going to be there. That mushroom may have never even been seen before if you've encountered it. It could be a new species, and hence the encouraging people to get into the woods. I'm happy to say that I haven't convinced many people it's important, but I have convinced more and more people to go into the woods with me to look for mushrooms. So I feel like the trend is in the right direction, at least. But mycophobia in particular is sort of a subject that harangues this scene, and people seem to, I don't know if it's really the case as much anymore. I feel like that's started to give way, and people are, if not fascinated generally, at least not as weirded out when I tell them that I'm interested in mushrooms, and even fewer than before seem to like raise their eyebrow and be like, which kind of mushrooms, like the psychedelic aspect is super important and is a big part of this, but it's just a part of this. But I get a lot of questions about the psychedelic aspect. And yeah, I wonder if that's become like, do you feel like that's the driving force in the interest these days? Like, and it leads me to another kind of topic I want to get into about just the risks associated with the popularization of this stuff and where it might get captured and commodified in ways that aren't healthy. But on the psychedelic point, yeah, what are your thoughts on just the seemingly sudden normalization of psychedelics and the role that plays in all of this?
I definitely notice a psychedelic presence in these new streams of fascination with fungi. And I think it's partly because many of these studies have been taking place with psilocybin, which is a fungal compound. And when people have psychedelic experiences with a fungal compound, I think there's a sense of like, well, hang on a sec, who produced this? Who are they? What world are they from? And so that's one aspect that I've been noticing. But I think also the way it's written up in the media, there's a lot of fungus imagery, fungus chat, potted fungal histories associated with the psychedelic, this resurgence in psychedelic interest and research, which is driving some of it. Of course, it might also be the psychedelic conditions themselves. People in psychedelic states are confusing and unruly states of mind that can, in some cases, lead people into places of questioning and feeling new types of relationship with the living world around them. And perhaps that is inviting people into a greater interest in the organisms that string together ecosystems. Like fungi. So these are all aspects of that I've noticed. But I wonder how has it struck you, the way that the psychedelic world, the burgeoning psychedelic world, and the burgeoning interest of fungi, how those two things are connected?
Yeah, they feel almost separate to me in a strange way, even though, like you said, they're related and they support one another. The idea of like going into a psychedelic state and then entering the woods and encountering strange beings like mushrooms, they're pretty, whether or not you're tripping when you do that, it's a nearly psychedelic experience. I've also noticed that a lot of mushroom people will refer to the mushroom as a who. Like, who are you? Or they met a mushroom, and there's a sort of personification or a sympathetic dynamic that at least we bring to that encounter. And so yeah, it makes sense that this is part of that piece. It does seem to like dominate the conversation. I feel like it's been a sort of an obstruction in a way to like having the other conversation that we were sort of touching on earlier about just the organisms themselves and ways of relating to them directly. No wonder. I mean, psychedelic substances are also a new, at least in the Western sort of mainstream world that we occupy, or that I occupy at least. It's only been, again, since the last century that they've entered our consciousness, literally. And so we're still reckoning with that tool that's become available to us, or that sacrament, however you view it. And I think it's a good thing that dimension of the sacred and the unknowable and the mysterious is sort of coming along with the study of this formal science, which, I'm into subversive things, and I like the idea that, it is weirding the process of doing science, and is enabling a broader spectrum of people to engage with mushrooms as a subject of study, and also as a means of expanding consciousness. And the two, I guess science is a sort of psychedelic pursuit in a way. I feel like you could put too fine a point on this idea pretty easily, so I won't go any further with that. But I do worry a bit that that psychedelics and psilocybin in particular is going to become pharmaceuticalized, and is going to become another commodity, or another extractive, another subject of extraction, and that we're going to view these things, all of this, with a sense of utility rather than a sense of questioning, at large. Because at the end of the day, the people who are really into mushrooms are still a pretty small percentage of the population. It's not it's not sweeping the globe. This isn't the Beatles. That's insects, but it's growing, and I feel like we've got this opportunity right now to set the relationship with this entire kingdom of life in a way on the right foot at an early stage. I've been saying to people that it's pretty profound. Imagine if you walked into the woods for the first time and saw the woods for the first time, or rather, you could walked into the woods your whole life and saw the woods for the first time. You saw the trees for the first time, or you saw the animals for the first time. And it's on that scale that we're talking about fungi, not as visible, not as consistently, engageable necessarily, but that's a profound thing. And I feel like it's important that we sort of get our terms right and our concepts straight about how we're going to walk into that introduction, or into that relationship that we're forging with this kingdom of life, or queendom of life, or queerdom of life. People have a lot of terms they like to sort of use, because that's, again, an opportunity here, I think, to challenge our presuppositions. I think a lot of people are encountering fungi with an aim to foster decolonial conversations, anti-capitalist conversations. It's somehow become the locus of all of these sort of radical communities, which again was what I was looking into, and what I found so interesting about it. I think the psychedelic has a huge part to play in that, in part because a lot of these communities are indigenous communities that had relationships with, I wouldn't say a lot of these communities are, a lot of them are white heteronormative spaces, honestly, but one of the groups that I encountered in my reporting was the POC fungi community in San Diego, or Kumeyaay land, as they would refer to it. And I was really struck by how what to my eyes was a pretty recognizable scene. There was this sort of common vernacular and pedagogy around educating people, bringing them into just the conversation around mushrooms. There were tables with tinctures and things that you'd see at any mushroom event these days, but there were also land back, documentation, or pamphlets, and conversations that you wouldn't find at most mushroom events, because the community is not the same. So I guess what I'm getting at is the meaning of people in that space. This is what I wanted to say about that. People in that space were telling me, we're not sure if we can afford the $500 session that this medicine is being, sold through, or sold as. It's a medicine that we've had access to culturally and communally for centuries, or since time immemorial. So it feels like this thing that is fostering a new sense of community and bringing people together and opening conversations is also being extracted like other things before it. And so I guess that's my concern about the psychedelic aspect of this. It creates a giant opportunity economically, and there's a long history book about what that can lead to, and how certain communities can be left out, and it's often the same communities. So my hope is that this is an opportunity to maybe change that script a bit. I don't know how we do that, but I think talking about it directly is maybe one way to start.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a huge issue, and it's a huge conversation in the many aspects of the psychedelic world as well. And I think that's an important thing in itself, that this is something that's being discussed from the beginning, and there are all sorts of ways that the conversation's unfolding, and there's all sorts of ways that the wild commercial IP grab has already happened. And so I think these stories are braided streams that will work together, and there's lots sorts of incredible people who are working so hard to think equitably about psychedelics and indigenous knowledge and patrimony and matrimony, to think about who has access to these medicines. Of course, you can't patent a mushroom itself. So with psilocybin, at least, there's a reassuring for me, at least, that one can grow these things very easily in all sorts of situations, very cheaply, and that will, that's not going to change. So, but yeah, it's a big aspect of the psychedelic world, and it's also an aspect of the fungal research and fungal interest more generally. You find, for example, fungi and the wellness industrial complex tied up in all sorts of ways now, and again, I don't think it's going away, and I don't think in itself is a problem, but it just raises, a number of questions to do with commodification. Of course, fungi are opportunists and wild relationship-forming creatures themselves. People often ask me about what I think about, well, what's happening when we're growing fungi inside big factories. For example, with microfabrication, when you're using a fungus to grow in and around corn stalk or hemp stalk to produce a composite material for building. And frankly, when I go into those facilities, it looks like a giant termite mound. It looks like the fungus has domesticated a whole load of humans who have made very expensive investment to feed as much food to a fungus as possible. So I think we can always read both ways round when it comes to these relationships. And I think frequently we are being domesticated as much as we are domesticating. So I find that reassuring as well.
I guess this is a time to disclose that I have recently begun working with a company that makes materials like you're describing, and I can attest to the nest-like appearance of that process. And the one thing we don't do is pray in front of the mushroom. That hasn't started happening yet, but I think it's it's definitely like we have the opportunity to extract and to exploit. So do they, and we do a lot for the sake of our own survival to mitigate their presence in our lives. There's molds we don't want. There's it's really easy to get kind of Pollyanna-ish or simplistic about these metaphors, but I do think they're powerful, and I think they're useful and coming to us at a good time. And there's something in the nature of the fungi themselves, like the opportunity of it. I guess I keep coming back to that because it's like you mentioned, you can't patent a mushroom. I don't know if spores are any different or if that's something to worry about down the line, but people can grow this stuff themselves, and for medicine, for food. A lot of the people I encountered were cultivators, and they were really focused on building local economies out, growing specialty mushrooms, which just happen to not have the best sort of shelf life. So they're sort of biased toward locality and support, the idea of this like distributed network of growers rather than a centralized system like, our food system reflects. And so, even in the models that emerge from the relationship, we see, a different pattern or a suggestion of another pattern that we could maybe embody at larger scales. And I really hope that part of the message gets carried up along the line with these broader conversations and with these more sort of immediately economically viable and fast growing parts of the mycological discourse and economy. I feel like saying that there's a message among the mushrooms, or that the mushrooms have a message, I don't know if that's like even a serious thing to say, but it does seem to inspire a lot of the same thoughts in humans, at least, or a lot of thoughts that harmonize, and principles that seem to harmonize. So yeah, I don't know. I guess it's a weird question, but do you feel like there is sort of a message inherent in, if not the mushrooms themselves, then in the encounter with them and in the relationships that we build with them?
I certainly think there are things we can learn from fungi. There's so many ways to be a fungus. All right, so this is an entire kingdom. This is broader categories, animals or plants, as we know, and so there are things we can generalize, and also it strikes me that there's whole different branches of the fungal world that we might learn different things from, that behave in radically different ways, that live totally different sorts of lives, as well. And also that the human, I mean, I think we're talking from a very much an Anglo-sphere perspective. We both, North Atlantic Anglo countries, but not to, in East Asia, fungi have been part of life and cuisine and medicine, and for a great deal of time, and likewise in Central and Eastern Europe, and so I think we're also, we're coming from this particularly, we might say mycophobic, we might say fungus blind place, but that there are, I mean, in Russia, for example, there are many names, common names, which are the names, like names for humans, human names, which are also mushroom names. I always think that's amusing that I can't think of one in English.
Jim.
One case. Yeah. And maybe this will start to happen more. But I think that's a really good indication of how deeply embedded fungal fascination is, for example, in Russian culture. But yeah, so the things we can learn, I think there's a lot we can learn. And on a general level, we might learn about ecological connectivity, the ways that symbiotic relationships are co-creative, that it's not like we just have two organisms which are separate and that we've joined them together with an arrow. It's more like this metaphor I've been finding very helpful recently. That Escher, MC Escher, his picture of drawing hands, one hand drawing the other hand, drawing the other hand, drawing the other hand, that these relationships are as important as the individuals doing the relating, that they are formed in the process of relationship, a relational field which is generative, and which maintains the identity of the organisms. I think this is something we can learn from fungi. I think that's really, really important. We can learn that, I think, from the living world in general, if we pay close enough attention, but fungi are particularly graphic illustrators of these truths. I think we can learn about network formation, building decentralized networks and systems, and as you touched on, local food growing, for example, local mushroom growing, using local waste streams, local producers, driving local economies. I think there are things about waste we can learn, designing cyclical waste systems rather than our dysfunctional philosophies of waste, which at the moment go in very straight lines from factory to landfill, more or less, or landfill into environment. I think there are things we can learn about process, about the processual view of life. So life being built up of processes. In fact, the whole universe being built up of processes rather than things. That things are really just stabilized bundles of processes. The stuff that makes you up today is different from the stuff that made you up 5 years ago. That you are a field of stability through which matter is passing. And processual thinking, I think, is enormously helpful, as contrasted with thing thinking or substance thinking. Mycelial network, for example, is never fully grown. It's constantly in a state of growing and unfolding. There's no body plan. There's no state at which you can say, there it is, it's grown up. So I think fungi remind us of this processual nature of reality in a really helpful way. I find that illuminating. I could keep going on, but another one I think is really simple, is the importance of that which is hidden, the importance of those lives which are hidden from us, whether because they're conducted inside or underground, or because they're too small for us to see. And I think this is one of the most profound There's things we can learn from fungi, and something which is apparent to anyone who spends time interacting with fungi. Mushroom hunting, for example, as we touched on earlier, there's a sense that you are encountering something which is there, and it will be there tomorrow, long after the mushroom has gone. So a sense in which that which lies hidden is generative, that which lies hidden gives rise to what we see, and that has power and also mystery.
Yeah, I love that. The relationship is the thing, right? It's the emergent properties of our relationships that give us anything to talk about or think about, or give us the means to think. Our brains are networks. It's I think a humbling message, like what you're outlining there, is maybe a call to humility for all of us to recognize our role rather than our station. Our maybe even our responsibility. Because just like them, we're playing a role, and it's taken us a long time to kind of appreciate that outside of the linear sense of like, I want that, I get that, I don't want that, it goes there. Obviously, like you said, some fungi are quite extractive, quite not the friendliest to their neighbors, but we don't have to pay attention to them in that metaphor. We're approaching the point of question time, so I don't want to get like too far afield into another line of thought here. But I guess I just wanted to see how you felt about the progression of this conversation of general interest in the subject since our respective books came out. And it was around the same time our books came out. So yeah, I mean, I can give my gloss on that too, but I'm curious for your reflection. Yeah, how do you feel like things have progressed since your book came out?
Well, as a fungus nerd, I find it really exciting that so many more people are thinking about these organisms. That the fungus blindness is obviously very much there still in many aspects of human life, but that there's I meet more and more people who are interested in fungal life, and so that's just satisfying on a basic nerd level. Find more nerds. On more potential fungus nerds. So that's gratifying just on a basic level. Then there's just being excited by, I receive letters from kids who are saying, I want to study fungi. How can I do it? What subject should I choose to be able to do this? And how can I'm about to go to university and I want to change subjects and study fungi. Like, what should I do? And so this for me is really, really exciting, that the young minds becoming fascinated in fungi and working out how they can learn more, so that's had a huge amount to me about how things are changing. I'm interested in what your sense is.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly deepened. I think whatever process or phenomenon I was tuning into in the early stages, I feel like has really broadened and deepened. And like we were saying before, less sideways glances, when the subject comes up, and more of a general curiosity. Lots of people who just instant solidarity with them when they find out I'm a mushroom guy. They're like, that's you're cool, if that's the case. That doesn't seem like it was always the dynamic, but I've probably been interested in them for about a decade now, so I don't have the broadest swath of time to sort of analyze from, or to compare from. But it does seem like undeniable that they've just taken a cultural position that they haven't had before. And yeah, I see a lot more festivals, these sort of small scale or medium scale regional mushroom festivals popping up, where the local character of the mycological scene, sure, but also I think a lot of the farmers will show up there, a lot of local entrepreneurs will show up there. You get an interesting cross section of a community when you go to a mushroom gathering in their vicinity, and more of those are popping up, and I see more and more connections being formed and more little companies starting. So it still feels like the early sort of bubbling of what's going to, I think, become just a massive part of day-to-day life for a lot of us. I think, I would bet a lot of things that we use are going to be made from mushrooms in the future. I bet that a lot of what we eat is going to be fungal based, and a lot of the ways we think seem to already be under transition from the influence of these conversations. And so I have hope for it. It's honestly one of my sources. It's not a long list these days, but one of my sources of hope is the way that people seem to sort of be coming to this subject and having their minds changed by it, and their ways of being changed by it. And it's time for that. So we're meeting mushrooms at the right time, I think.
And also, I also find that when thinking about things from a fungal point of view, thinking about the living world from a fungal point of view, we run into plants, we run into bacteria, you run into animals, but just from a slightly different angle, and the familiar can become unfamiliar, and that tree can look slightly different when you think of it from the perspective of its mycorrhizal networks, rather than think about the mycorrhizal networks from the perspective of the tree that you see. So I think that defamiliarization, that way in which the familiar can become unfamiliar through the study of fungi, I think is really helpful, and not just with regard to those fungi out there, but with regard to all these other wonderful aspects of the living world that form such an important part of our lives.
They say if you pull on one thread in the tapestry of life, it leads you to the whole picture, no matter which thread you choose. But fungi are the most thread-like, it seems. So maybe we're just pulling on them first and foremost. Do we have questions that we're going to get to here? I'm not sure what the process is for.
I think they might be. Hold on.
I suppose we could just read them straight from this list that we have here.
Okay. Yes.
There's a good number of them. Can we just run down the list?
Yeah, let's run down the list. So, interested in hearing more on the negative fungal diseases, especially honey fungus. Do we know that this kind of fungal disease is becoming more common and difficult to combat due to warming climates? Is there anything we can do to make our gardens and ecosystems more resilient? It's a good question. And when we're having conversations like these we tend to focus on the positive aspects of fungal life, but obviously fungi have been and will continue to be complex co-creatures on this planet with humans. Fungal diseases cause a huge amount of damage, and will continue to do so. One of the things that's happening with this climate shift is that the ranges of fungal pathogens are shifting as well, and fungal pathogens can arrive in a whole new area and kill hundreds of acres of forest. And we're already seeing that with situations like the pine beetle, and we're seeing it in areas in British Columbia where trees are becoming more drought stressed and then vulnerable to fungi that aren't new pathogens for them, but which they would have been more easily able to defend themselves from before they became stressed. So I think this is going to become ever more pronounced. In terms of making one's gardens and ecosystems resilient, I think basic practice of making sure that you have a living soil. Are you feeding the living soil? Have you got a busy, bustling community in the ground? Are you using rich, live, whole composts, compost teas? Are you making sure that plants are growing in a way that I would say align with more traditional organic practices? I mean organic before I know that's a complex term these days. But I would say it comes down to soil health fundamentally, and that if you have a healthy soil community, then you will be defending yourself as best you can from incoming fungal pathogens. Although I don't think it's always going to be possible to defend oneself from incoming fungal pathogens, because the history of vegetation certainly in Western Europe in modern times is a part of that history is a history of fungal diseases. The chestnut blight in the States, elm disease in Europe, now ash dieback, transforming landscapes and creating conditions of famine. So reducing monocropping, increasing soil health, that's what comes to mind right away in generic terms.
Yeah, I would also add that another feature of these communities around fungi is a recognition of soil biodiversity and soil as a universe unto itself that is criminally understudied and needs to be prioritized. The second question on this list, many people are having to plant non-native species in their land to accommodate for climate change, since native species can't withstand those changes. Does the planting of non-native species invite non-native symbiotic arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, which may have a negative impact on existing ecosystems? I guess basically, are we sort of feeding the process of disruption by trying to adapt to it? And what are the implications for the symbiotic fungi that have relationships with those plants? I think it speaks to what you were saying a second ago, that like all of these things are sort of pulling each other in new directions. And I guess that's how it gives me some comfort to think, I guess, that like this is how nature works. It's a constantly roiling thing. It's not really got a steady state. And so, we're probably participating in that transition, but I mean, this is definitely something you could speak to more directly than I.
I know someone who's doing a study right now, an amazing study, which is using botanical gardens around the world to look at whether trees that are planted in botanical gardens in arboretums, trees which come from other parts of the world, and what's their mycorrhizal situation now they're living established lives in a garden in a very different place from where they come from, and what's going on to the mycorrhizal communities there. Do you see some naturalizing as those plants start to work with the local strains of mycorrhizal fungi, or do you see that they're retaining their sorts of communities they'd have in the places that they have been brought from? I don't know the answer yet, but it struck me as a really ingenious study, and I was very excited to hear that someone was looking at it in those terms. And more generally, the history of plant life is a history of plant migrations, and that plants move and they migrate, and they have huge changes in range that expand and contract over time, and part of that is to do with what fungal relationships they're able to form and to forge. So I would say that whatever we are doing, and no doubt we are introducing in many cases fungal strains from another place, but maybe those plants need those fungal strains to live in the place that we're moving them to, and that if we saw that as a process of a process that has happened many times before, then it's not in itself bad. It could be very disruptive if those strains of mycorrhizal fungi become weedy strains. They go and start causing havoc. Obviously, that's a disaster. Likewise, it's a disaster if we introduce plants to a situation where they go on to cause great problems. But it's very the basic principle of moving plants around with their microbial communities, I don't think is a problem in itself.
And the next question, I feel like, follows up on this subject, just in terms of mycelial networks and their role in crop production and the benefits of a healthy mycelial system to soil and produce, and what a healthy mycological system looks like. To my mind, I mean, related to the last point, I know a lot of agriculture in terms of AMF is done with like just a common set of strains that are sort of bought and added. They're like treated as additives to the soil and when you're planting things. My understanding is that there's a reason a lot of people in these mycological subcultures are interested in like permaculture and holistic land management and things like that, because rather than treating these as additives or inputs, they could be treated as parts of an ecosystem, which is like this perspective we keep talking about. So I guess like I wonder if that's even an approach. Like, can we trust that the right mycorrhizal fungi will find the plant that it will benefit, or do we need to be sort of engineering this relationship in terms of like, I mean, for a farmer, they need to meet yields. It's not enough to know that they have a thriving ecosystem. They actually have to grow things at a certain rate. So, yeah, can we foster those kinds of relationships, and what do they look like?
Yeah, I think we can definitely foster them. The most commercial inoculum it's been like very well established by now. Most of it is not very effective. At worst, we'll be introducing weedy mycorrhizal species to a place where they shouldn't be, and could just be they're not alive. Lots of these inoculums, when they're looked at, they don't have any viable spores in them, or no viable fungal tissue, so you're just wasting your money, or they're just producing no particularly important outcome, and so the concept of inoculating, though, I think is a very powerful one, and there are people doing really important work about how best to do that. So, for example, the work of Jim Beaver's lab in the States, all sorts of work with tallgrass prairie and reestablishment of milkweed, and in restoring this grassland, and using whole soil inoculum from healthy grassland. The full soil communities can be very helpful for the establishment of these grasses, which makes sense given how much they depend on what's going on below the ground. The problem is there's not enough healthy soil in the world to take from all the healthy places and put in all the places that need to be restored. And so we could imagine a situation where you have a kind of a totally perverse soil grab a scenario. What they're also finding is that you can culture the ecologically relevant communities of mycorrhizal fungi, and then you could use those cultures of ecologically relevant fungi, which are by ecologically relevant I mean the right strains and the right communities. They work in communities, not just one strain, one species. So by making those ecologically matched inocula, there could well be ways that we can think more carefully about how plants are interacting with the below ground world. And I think this is indeed one of the places where we should be doing a lot more research. And I'm glad to say that it is underway.
I would also point to mycoremediation efforts that many people are researching in terms of just applied mycology and like working with these organisms in a directed way. Danielle Stevenson at UC Riverside is an example I would point people to. She's doing some amazing work with brownfields and contaminated land in LA. Looks like we're at time. I feel like we could maybe take on this last question real quickly, if that's okay. How can we further popularize or frame the interest for fungi from a conservation perspective? My only contribution on this one would just be to reiterate education and the recognition of fungi. One of the things in my book is a profile of iNaturalist, which is an app that has become popular pardon me, for documenting and just kind of crowdsourcing identification and of all sorts of organisms, but fungi are particularly popular. And one of the people at that company put it to me that once you recognize something, you want to protect it. And I feel like that's abundantly true. And there is thankfully a lot of resources, many more resources emerging all the time to learn about fungi. So I would just encourage anyone who's interested in conserving them to learn about them and educate others about them, and take your friends into the woods and get them to recognize fungi, because that's where it starts. What's your take on that?
I'm just aware that we should probably wrap, but I just briefly point about an organization I'm working with, which I think is a good example of ways that we might think about fungal conservation. It's called SPUN, the Society for the Protection of Underground Networks, working to document mycorrhizal fungal communities around the world, and then to try and use these big data sets to invite policymakers, conservation project makers, restoration managers to take account of the life of the soil when they're doing their conservation, making their decisions, making their policies, and to provide data sets to allow them to take account of the soil when they do those. Because a lot of the time, if you want to, you can want to take account of fungi in the soil, but you don't know how, because there's no reliable data set to do so. So for me, a big part of it does involve empirical science, building baseline data sets, talking to, as well as talking to decision makers, talking to policy makers, just generating interest and fascination.
Well, I guess that's it. This was a pleasure. Thanks for your time, and thanks everyone for tuning in. And thank you to the Oxford Real Farming Conference for having us. This has been a real treat, a good way to start my day. Cheers, everybody.
Yeah, thanks so much.